Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Okay, so we've got two more items. One on kind of a roundup of recent privacy developments, and then the final item that David is going to take, which is really interesting, is about Google potentially losing younger users to TikTok and Instagram for what would otherwise be local search and other kinds of lookups. But Mike, why don't we turn to you? You chose three items together that kind of comprise a little privacy suite discussion.
So the first piece of news was, big surprise, Amazon is turning over Ring data to police even without a warrant and with no permission from the owners. Amazon has always said that they either needed consent or a warrant. Turns out they don't need either. They've been renowned for their very close relationships with police, and it just shows how dangerous this kind of data is and how loose companies play with it, even though it's just first-party data, just first-party. In other words, they have complete control over it, but they still abuse that right. And the second article that I found fascinating was that ICE, without any allowance to do so, has bought up private information sources and now has dossiers on 3 out of every 4 Americans, which is incredibly amazing, with virtually no oversight and nobody to answer to on these issues. Sort of an outcome of, I guess, 9/11, but just a bizarre overreach that nobody has bothered to rein in. One assumes that they are aware of it.
And before you go to the third one, ICE is Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, for people who are unfamiliar with the acronym.
Right, part of Homeland Security. But they've accumulated massive amounts of data
through public databases. It's worth noting that this is all public information that anybody theoretically could capture and aggregate.
Well, some of it is public. Some of the travel information is only they have access to, but it's a combination of resources. But an abuse that sort of is mind-boggling, although hardly less dangerous to our individual rights and freedoms than what Amazon is doing with the police. And then finally, the FTC, which is charged with enforcing sort of integrity in the marketplace, has decided to focus on location data abuses, that they're going to go after unauthorized uses of sensitive data, including location and personal health information. So to some extent, this appears to be a response to overturning Roe v. Wade. And they called out data aggregators and brokers, particularly who collected and resold these types of data. I know that you have a lot of color around that, so maybe you could.
Well, there's a lot of interesting things in what you said, but just to add some additional background to, or additional color to what you were talking about with the FTC, one of the things that they said is that when a company or aggregator, whomever, claims that the data is anonymous or has been anonymized, that is going to be deceptive in most cases, and they will go after those companies. So every single mobile location data company, location intelligence company, people that do measurement of store visits and bring together various data points for profiles or for audience segments, all of them say this is anonymized data. And what the FTC said is that in cases where that's not true, there's a consumer deception instance that they'll go after. And they added that, according to third-party research, 95% of these allegedly anonymized data instances you can reconstruct individual identity. So what they seem to be saying is that the whole industry that captures location data, packages it up, and makes it available for sale, which is an ecosystem of app developers, data aggregators and brokers, and then brands and retailers and ad networks.
And software development kits, sometimes provided by the likes of Facebook or somebody
Yes,
else
yes.
are in that mix.
Right. So there's a real cloud now in my mind, a real question mark, putting aside enforcement and the resources to enforce this, about what is compliant now. What's legal, what's compliant, because it's a pretty sweeping pronouncement. And I mean, I'm not disagreeing with it, because location is a very, very sensitive piece of information, especially now, where people who are going to cross state lines for reproductive decisions are going to be prosecuted, which they're already talking about in Ohio for the unfortunate case of the 10-year-old who was raped and went to Indiana for an abortion. They're talking about prosecuting the doctor across state lines. But anyway, so that's just all very sensitive. But it raises a big question about what kinds of disclosures must you have, what kinds of consent must you get, and who who's going to be compliant. I think it's a big. um, I think they've sort of thrown down the gauntlet, and we'll see what the enforcement looks like. That's going to be the big question. Who are they going to go after? What are the penalties going to be? What are the remedial measures that are going to be mandated going to look
I happen to
It
think
does.
that location is one of the, from a user standpoint, that outside of the context of using maps for a navigational purpose, that it is one of the least helpful pieces of information that I could give a service to make my experience better, right? If I'm doing a search, even in Google, right, and I say, you know, abortion doctors near me, right? It would be just as easy for me to type abortion doctors Indianapolis or whatever. Like, I don't think that the concept of location is so important
default
that
default location.
yeah, exactly. So I would be perfectly fine if the FTC said, actually, no company is allowed to use location data for anything. I don't think the consumer experience would be meaningfully degraded by that decision.
Well, it would put the burden on consumers to be more specific in their queries and to refine. I mean, if you're looking for product inventory, location is helpful. I mean, initially, what Google has said, even though there's a lot of near me searches going on, is that Google has conditioned people to expect that their results will be specific to their location. And so the near me query, Google was saying a couple of years ago, was sort of falling away. So people were just doing Indian restaurants, or uh, um, shoes, or whatever the queries would be. Um, I don't think you're wrong, and I think that, I mean, I don't disagree with you, and I think that it would just place an additional burden on, for a step. You'd have to do an additional step, add your zip, add the geo where you wanted to get the information. So it wouldn't be that big a deal, and that would be evidence of consent.
And in most cases, in my opinion, the use of location data is just an incredibly predatory thing. It makes my eyeballs, my interactions more valuable to an advertiser as opposed to actually helping me.
Well, in defense of that whole industry, which I got to know very, very well over a period of time, I can tell you that I don't think most of the people that I talked to were ethical, or trying to be ethical. And they were genuinely not trying to provide data on individuals. They were trying to deliver market segments that could be targeted, uh, in a broader framework. So that the ability to identify people who are frequent McDonald's uh, eaters, users, I was going to say, or who go to the gym often, or
Users
who,
probably work in that
yeah,
context too,
yeah,
actually.
or people shopping for cars. That's incredibly valuable to marketers. And the idea that you could track an ad exposure to a physical store visit was something that was really a revelation for people who were speculating about which channels were driving. I mean, you still have the last click problem, but speculating about which channels were actually driving behavior. It was incredibly valuable to see those analytics. And so I think there's enormous
But
value
again,
to
how does that help?
marketers.
How does that help a consumer? I certainly understand how
It
that helps
doesn't.
Audi
It
or
doesn't.
Chevy
It
or
doesn't.
whatever. But
It
yeah,
doesn't. I mean, Amazon, to come back to Amazon, is released a thing called Store Analytics, where they're going to sell data, shopping data, to CPG companies, and they're going to get that data from their Just Walk Out technology in their dash cart, which will have individualized information on it, and that's going to be very valuable for those CPG companies. But in response to the question, what does that do to the consumer? They basically say, well, it's going to provide a better experience, sort of generically, and I think that that's total BS. Okay.
Speaking of these abuses, it wasn't that long ago that Tim Hortons was settled a case where their app was tracking their users against their permissions,
Right,
to understand what competitive coffee shops they were going to. Again, this has nothing to do with the consumer. The one question I have about this whole thing, though, is whether a first-party app online ecosystem, i.e. Walmart, i.e. Target, Costco, whatever, might give those bigger players an advantage.
yes,
in
totally,
this whole thing.
totally,
If it
because
does come to play where the FTC does clamp down.
right, it's one of these sort of unintended consequences scenarios, because Google and Apple and big players, as you say, like Walmart, that have a complete soup to nuts relationship with the customer, can capture that data and can activate it and use it. It's really when you get into third party transfers of that data that it becomes problematic from a privacy standpoint.
With the
And so,
exception of Amazon.
yes, but so it will inadvertently or unintentionally provide, and if they do very strong enforcement of this, an advantage to those larger companies that have the full end to end data access and permissions and so on and so forth. And it'll require more transparency at the app level, including discussion of where the data would go, and it should include the ability, as Apple does, to say no, and then have consumers be confident that that's not going to be shared, a la Amazon. So
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.